Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, back for our weekly Penn State podcast with Seth Engle of the Post-Gazette and the Daily Collegian. Seth, an interesting week for Penn State. They do, in fact, lose Manny Diaz as defensive coordinator. He takes the Duke head coaching job. You and I had talked about, the possibility of, would he take that job? Was that the job that he would want to hold out for? Kind of like Brent Pry did in staying at Penn State for a couple of years. He decides not to wait. He decides to go to Duke. I was a bit surprised. What about you, Seth?
I wasn't surprised in the fact that he got a job. I was surprised that he jumped at Duke, which is a team that's, it's a hard program to win with. It's a basketball-oriented university, as we know. But, he, saw fit and has experience in the ACC and jumped at the opportunity. So, I'm happy for Manny Diaz, but it won't be an easy task whatsoever, especially considering, their star quarterback, Riley Leonard, is now off to Notre Dame. Pretty much going to have to build from scratch there in the first year outside of the Mike Elko program. But Manny Diaz has, he showed some, a lot of positives over his 2 years with Penn State. He's a player's coach. He was very well respected on both sides of the ball at Penn State, and you kind of saw on the field how that panned out. Like it was, two generational defenses under him, and completely kind of revolutionized that side of the ball. It was only a matter of time before he found a job, and he finds it at Duke.
Yeah, I think you really have to look at the Mike Elko, how much money he got out of Texas A&M and say, well, Duke may not be the best job in the world, but, the bar is pretty low too. If you can win a little bit, if you can, get on the national stage a little bit, you can parlay it into something bigger. And I think that was probably the calculus here. If Mike Elko doesn't go to Texas A&M and he goes to some other program, maybe we're not having this conversation, but I think the way he proved that it was a viable path, probably weighed on Manny Diaz's decision. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out from afar. But closer to home, Seth, wanted to talk to you about how Penn State now goes about replacing Manny Diaz. You made a list, Markham Wogenrich, who does some work for Sports Illustrated now. He made a list of possible defensive coordinator candidates. So we're just going to go down those lists and talk about some of these guys and how much sense they do or do not make for Penn State. I want to start with some of the internal candidates who, I think there's still a debate about, as we're recording this on Tuesday afternoon. We're not sure exactly what Penn State's plans are going to be for the bowl game, for the interim. Anthony Poindexter and analyst Rob Smith seem like the two candidates. Seth, I guess first break them down for how you expect things to play out for the Peach Bowl, and then how you look at those two guys as possible replacements for Manny Diaz without having to go outside.
Yeah, I think Poindexter is the obvious, favorite to be the interim guy come late December here, just based on the fact that he was the interim already during the Outback Bowl when Brent Pry left. With that being said, Penn State didn't have a guy on their staff, like you mentioned, Rob Smith, who's been an offensive analyst, but this is a guy with an extensive defensive coordinator background. He was a coordinator at multiple Power 5 schools. He's coached in the NFL. So he was Duke's defensive coordinator just last year. He's also had stops at Rutgers and also at Arkansas and I believe Minnesota as well. So he's really been around. And if you're looking for an interim guy, I think Rob Smith does have the resume to kind of just be someone who obviously knows the program, but also knows kind of what it takes to be a Power 5 DC. Poindexter, has the coordinator experience as well, having, had the role at UConn. And maybe they want to kind of test him out in a big game like that again, if he's, really considering potentially getting the full-time job. So it could probably go either ways. Another reason it might be Rob Smith is also because of the fact that he's a linebackers guy, and they've run a linebacker system under Diaz, who was the linebackers coach as well. They want to keep things maybe more similar to how they were before. Maybe they stick with Smith, but Poindexter is probably the favorite in that regard.
And you think that's true for both jobs, the interim and the long term?
In terms of linebackers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at like Franklin's kind of track record with Penn State, he's only had one coordinator, in his time here that wasn't the linebackers coach. That was Bob Shoop. That was the first DC that he had in town, and probably his least successful defensive coordinator. Since then, it's been Pry and Diaz pretty much holding down the fort and defining themselves as two of the best defensive coordinators in the entire country. And Penn State's had a very consistent defense under the watch of a linebackers coach. And I do think it's something that they'll take into consideration with the full-time gig, especially considering if they promote a position coach that isn't linebackers, then they'll have to go out and hire another linebackers coach, which I don't know if they'd want to do.
You don't think there's any chance they consider Bob Shoop to come back? I think he's in the USFL now. He had the Tennessee job. That's where he left Penn State for. But yeah, he's now out of college and the NFL. He had success here. He had solid defenses. I don't know. He was a huge departure, from the Bill O'Brien era, from the late Joe Paterno era. But certainly Penn State's had more success since then. So do you see a retread hire like that as unlikely?
I don't. I mean, I just kind of look at what Franklin's done with these coaching hires, and it just doesn't seem like he's really comfortable going backwards. We saw that kind of with Joe Moorhead, maybe a little bit this offseason, where I don't know how highly they were necessarily considering going back to Moorhead, despite his success in town. There are a lot of different things that go into it, and I just think there are candidates out there that would make more sense at this point than Shoop or than Moorhead did a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I kind of have a hard time imagining that. I think, the one thing James Franklin has done with that defensive coordinator job is promote from within. I think Manny Diaz was the exception because he was such a hot commodity. If you don't have a home run hire, I think keeping guys internal and making an internal promotion here makes some level of sense. This isn't offensive coordinator where, you want to kind of make a splash and be sexy. You just got to get the job done. So I wouldn't be surprised if the search ends where we're talking right now with the guys that they know from the inside. But we got some time to fill in this episode. We're going to talk about some external candidates as well. One name that was on both your list and Mark Wogenrich's list was Tom Allen, the recently fired Indiana coach. Seen him have some level of success in the Big Ten. Had put out some solid defenses, especially earlier in the tenure. We all remember that 2020 where I think Indiana was threatening for a New Year's Six spot, which is pretty hard to imagine. So he did a lot of solid work there. Things kind of tailed off toward the end. What do you think of his candidacy as potentially a Manny Diaz type of former head coach that's suddenly available that might be a nice asset with his experience level?
Yeah, well, if it's not Anthony Poindexter, I do think Tom Allen makes the most sense here. Franklin says it all the time, but what he's looking for in a coordinator is a head coach of the unit. And that's what Manny Diaz was. He was quite literally a head coach a couple of years ago and, ran his defense in a very similar fashion. And I think Tom Allen would bring, maybe a similar flair. Indiana's a ridiculously difficult job to succeed in. And you remember those years over 2018, 2019, 2020, like Indiana was a good team, consistently giving Penn State a run for their money. 2020, they finally got it done. But this is a guy who Franklin has a ton of respect for. Every time the Indiana game rolls around, he tells us how much he appreciates him and respects him as a head coach. And I just think, based on their prior kind of relationship, it would just be a really good fit. And the fact that, despite Tom being a head coach for the past few years, he was running their defense. Like he was basically their defensive coordinator as well, almost like how Ryan Day kind of runs the Ohio State offense. That's how Allen was at Indiana. So I think, some of those things can kind of transfer over. And I do think there are a ton of benefits that come with being a head coach and going back to coordinating.
Yeah, I think he's high on the list for a reason, Seth. One of the other Big Ten DCs that came up on Mark Wogenrich's list was Joe Harris Simc. He's the Rutgers defensive coordinator. He has some head coaching experience. He's on that Greg Schiano coaching tree. What are your thoughts on the possibility of Penn State hiring him? I think the results are not necessarily there for a job of this caliber. I think his defense allowed about 31 points a game over the last 5 games. And granted, it's Rutgers. How high can your expectations be? But I just don't know if there's enough meat on that bone for me, given some of these other candidates we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, Rutgers definitely did step up defensively this year. And I believe he's only been there for, a couple years. So he doesn't have too much Power 5 coordinating experience. But, like you said, he's been a head coach before. At a small school at Maine. He's had some other positional coaching jobs around the Big Ten. But this is a guy that I think you need to wait on a little more. Maybe someone you keep, maybe you bring him in for a couple interviews and build a relationship with, because he's only in his 30s. Like, he's going to be around for a little bit. Build a relationship, build a connection, but not necessarily pull the trigger. I just think there are maybe some better options out there. Some more highly qualified, more experienced candidates. But I do think it's worth taking a look at because he has been, pretty successful in a relatively short window.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think with both Tom Allen and Joe Harris Simc, you have the talent issue. I mean, you're never going to have the athletes at these places to do what Penn State does on defense, to crank out those top defensive rankings. Penn State just has more horses, so you would think both of these guys could thrive with a little bit more talent. But like I said, I would like to see a little bit more seasoning, in this specific regard, just because, this is, I think Manny Diaz has turned this into one of, at least the top 5 defensive coordinator jobs in the country. I think, he'd be a good DC at a lot of other places first before he comes here, or to Happy Valley. I'm in Pittsburgh. Seth, another name you had on your list that I found interesting was Tony Gibson from NC State. Do you want to explain your reasoning there?
Yeah, I mean, since he took over, NC State has had one of the best defenses in the country, year in, year out. They're great at stopping third downs, which I think is, a really important thing. And forcing turnovers as well has been kind of his calling card, which is what Penn State was known for this year. Their turnover margin, maybe the best in the country. But he's kind of spent his career a lot around West Virginia. So he knows the area well. That's a big region for Penn State, is West Virginia, East Coast schools. He knows the area. He's done well at an ACC school. I think he's a guy that you definitely give a look to. I just don't know if maybe you consider him as much as you would Tom Allen, Poindexter, or even the Rutgers guy. I think that there's a small pool of candidates, but I think there's a lot to choose from here in terms of what you want to do.
A very interesting name that's come up for a lot of people is Jim Leonhard, the former Wisconsin defensive coordinator. He won the Broyles Award as the nation's top, one of the nation's top coordinators. So he's got some bona fides. He's spent some time with Brett Bielema at Illinois as an analyst this past season. But obviously he left town when Paul Chryst's regime left town in Madison. So he's done a lot of great work. I think my big hang up with him, Seth, is he runs that 3-4 defense. I think that'd be a huge transition for Penn State philosophically, not just, from Manny Diaz to Jim Leonhard possibly, but from Penn State's whole history, as long as I've been alive. They've never played a 3-4. I don't think. And so I think that would just be a little bit, philosophically not a fit, even if he does have great resume.
Yeah, it wouldn't really make any sense to me to change up your whole scheme for a defensive coordinator. I mean, Penn State, like you said, this is a program that's kind of had this defense down pat for generations. Really impressive, not just under Diaz, but dating back to Paterno era. Long before that, Penn State has always been known for their defense, primarily a 4-3. So I don't think that bringing in a guy who runs a 3-4 system is really the way to go. Especially when you have to consider the fact that, this is a job that defensive coordinators don't necessarily stick around for a long time. Last 2 guys have jumped ship for an ACC job. The guy before that left for Tennessee. There are upgrades in store if you do well at Penn State. And I don't think that changing your whole system would necessarily be the best move, especially considering, the long-term impacts.
It is easy to fantasize about Abdul Carter in a TJ Watt type of role, though, isn't it? I mean, I think that's part of the appeal. I think there's probably a lot of Steelers fans out there that say, they're familiar with the 3-4. They see Alex Highsmith, TJ Watt. They say, why can't Penn State do that? I agree with you. I think it'd be too big of a transition. But it is, it is intoxicating on some level to imagine that type of defense in Happy Valley.
I do think that there is some room to maybe mesh some of those concepts in, we saw it this year with, having 3 defensive ends on the line, stuff like that. Like, I think Abdul Carter potentially coming to the line of scrimmage more next year is an option. Obviously that'll come down to who they bring in, whether they're comfortable with that, but he's putting on weight, and I think that he has, a potential future as maybe a defensive end. I don't think you have to change up your whole system to maybe get him some looks at defensive end, especially with Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac likely both gone next year. It's maybe something that you want to consider, but I don't know if it's worth, changing your whole system just for maybe something like that.
The complete opposite end of the spectrum, Seth, we have Blake Baker. He's at Missouri now. He was Manny Diaz's defensive coordinator down at Miami. So obviously there's a lot of connective tissue there. Is he someone you consider as possibly, one of the least disruptive candidates you could hire and kind of just keeping the train moving, doing the things that Manny Diaz did well and continuing that tradition? Or do you wonder if, Penn State learned enough in those 2 years from Manny Diaz that expertise is already in-house in guys like Poindexter?
It'd be pretty interesting if they went out and did that. A guy who's at Missouri, I think it would kind of say a lot about what Penn State's able to do to maybe pull from other programs. You saw them pull from Kansas to get their offensive coordinator, but if they could maybe get a lateral move out of an SEC program, I think says something. I think it does help to kind of bring in a guy who is, from a similar system and who maybe the players loved Manny Diaz. If they can get Manny to kind of tell them like, this guy's legit, like he's all right. I think that, maybe calms some nerves a little bit and maybe makes people a little more comfortable about the next regime. So yeah, I definitely think it's something that you consider, and you kind of talk to all people here. There's no shortage of candidates that you can talk to. You don't have to consider everyone, but you can do your due diligence, and maybe you'll find someone in the rough who really stands out. And I think that's kind of what Franklin's strategy is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's a name to watch for. Zack Arnett is also in that pile of recently fired coaches. He took over for the late Mike Leach at Mississippi State, fired after less than a full season. So didn't really get to show what he could do down there for very long. Seth, what's your read on Zack Arnett and how he might fit here?
I don't think there's much of a fit at all. He wasn't, before he was a head coach, he wasn't that great of a defensive coordinator. Mississippi State was pretty good under Leach. And that was, mostly because of his offensive system, not because they were playing great defense. I think he's a good leader. I think he held the program together in a, extremely difficult time, which says a lot about maybe what he's able to do with the room. But I don't think he's necessarily, a great defensive coach that would uphold the same standard that Diaz did over the past couple of years. He was good at San Diego State, had some history there, and made it to the SEC. But I just don't see that as an upgrade whatsoever in replacement of Diaz.
Yeah, or even a maintaining station. I like a lot of the names that we've talked about here so far, a lot more. One more I want to throw at you, Seth. I was a little surprised that Mark included this guy on his list because he just took the USC defensive coordinator job. That was D'Anton Lynn, the former Penn State cornerback. So obviously he's got some connections to the program. His dad, Anthony Lynn, is one of the hottest commodities in pro football coaching. I hear him for every job that comes up, I feel like. What are your thoughts on him potentially jumping ship on USC before he coaches a single game there? I think it's unlikely. I think that's I think there's it'd be very easy for him to make progress there and to make people in LA happy, given what they dealt with at that program. I think he only has to allow like 30 points a game, and people will think he's a genius. So logistically, I think it's probably an easier job than coming to Penn State. But what say you about Penn State potentially bringing him home?
You have to assume that Franklin's a little upset that Diaz took so long to kind of get this deal with Duke figured out, because in that span, Lynn kind of went from UCLA to USC. I believe it was only a week before Diaz was hired. And this was a guy, UCLA struggled a ton this year, especially on the offensive side, but that defense was very sturdy. And he's an alum, he has a ton of experience. I think he would be at the top of this board had he still been at UCLA, having just, signed a new deal with a team that doesn't typically deal with lateral moves in USC. I just don't think it's likely, which is, a shame for Franklin and Penn State, because this is, a guy who, who'll have the resources to succeed at USC. Maybe someone you keep in the back pocket for years to come. Elijah Robinson was another name, maybe similar in that regard, who's, a Penn State alum. He was Texas A&M's interim head coach after Jimbo Fisher. He was their defensive line coach. And, in the time that Diaz waited out, Robinson was hired by Syracuse to be their DC. And, since that, they've seen an influx of recruiting in the East Coast area. But another name to keep in mind, for years to come. We know these DC jobs at Penn State, they're not a forever situation. A lot of these times, some of these guys jump ship and get another head coaching job.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that, I think that James Franklin's very good at is he has the Rolodex. He has guys who, if you read about, I remember reading the oral history about how Joe Moorhead was hired at Penn State and how far back that relationship went. And, I think that's when we talk about, James Franklin being a CEO type of coach and making good hires and having a deep connections. These are the types of guys you maybe do start building with now, and maybe they're not the guy for the moment, but they could be the guy, for the future. And I think that's kind of what sets James Franklin apart in a lot of ways from a lot of other coaches around the country. Seth, anything else stand out to you from the bowl press conference? I know James Franklin spoke. I know Patrick Kraft spoke a little bit, about where they go with the defensive coordinator job. Were there any highlights that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I think the thing that really stood out to me was kind of the realization and maybe the reminder that this Penn State defensive coordinator job is definitely one of the top assistant coaching jobs in the entire country. This is a job that, like I talked about, has shown that you will potentially get a head coaching job if you succeed. And it also just dons a level of consistency that I think a lot of programs and a lot of units across the country lack. They consistently bring in talent, they develop talent, and they just are able to just pump out top 10 defenses every single year. Usually it's a question of the offense, and that's why Penn State can't get to the level that it wants to get to. But that defense is, almost never in question. So I think candidates realize that, and I think it does open the door for a lot of what Penn State's able to do in this search.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds if they go kind of maybe for a home run type of hire again. Andy Kozelnicki, I think, surprised a lot of us. We assumed that there was some level of opening the checkbook. We'll see if Pat Kraft does that again. Seth, are you worried at all that some of these guys that haven't entered the transfer portal yet are going to wait it out, and if they don't like the hire that Penn State makes, that there could be some later defections into the portal here as we get into the deeper parts of December? Or do you think there's a level of trust with whomever James Franklin brings in that the lack of portaling we've seen so far will continue pretty much regardless of who he chooses?
I don't think James is going to pick someone that his players aren't going to approve of. It's the same way where, maybe he had Drew Aller, not necessarily, leading the hiring process, but had him as a supporting voice, because this is a guy you're going to be working with directly. I think it's going to be the same way with those defensive leaders. Kind of say, hey, we're going to bring in this guy. Let me know what you think. I don't know if they meet. I don't know how that works exactly. But to have them as a voice, to say, are you okay with this? How does your group feel about this guy? And kind of take it from there. Once a hire is made, I'd be surprised if people transfer. Maybe if they don't fit the system, then maybe they do. But I would think if that were to happen, it happened before the hire's made. And I'm honestly a little surprised that maybe we didn't see a couple guys enter after Diaz left, just considering how highly regarded he was and how respected he was within that room, and kind of how he treated his players. And I don't know, there's still time this offseason, but definitely still something to keep an eye on.
Seth, it's been a week since we last talked about the other side of the ball on offense. I feel like every week we talk about the receivers on here. I think his name was Dion Burks, the receiver from Purdue, one of the best possible targets in the transfer portal now. He had talked to Penn State, but he ends up going to Oklahoma, committing to Oklahoma. So Penn State loses out on a big target there. They have yet to bring anyone in. Is it early enough in December that you're not concerned yet? Or, would you like to have seen a guy come in here by now to reassure people that Penn State can go out in the portal and grab some guys? Because you've talked, in the past about, hey, the way the offense played this year, Penn State might have some trouble going into the portal and getting guys. Is that what you're kind of seeing reflected here, or are you still hopeful that they can make some moves?
Well, they got one. They got Alan Heron from Shorter, Division II.
I did see that, yes.
They got their groundbreaking transfer. So it's been a success already. No, I'm just kidding. But they got one guy, O-line depth, obviously a project. He's 6'6", 310 pounds. Hasn't played Division I football yet. But I guess for wide receiver, there is some cause for concern after missing out on Burks. That was, a top target, like you mentioned, had talked with him. Just to me, like we've talked about this before, but seeing the struggles that the receiving core had this year, and even last year too, where Parker Washington's numbers dipped a little bit, partially because of an injury, but he was not the same receiver that he was in 2021, that's for sure. But if you're a transfer, kind of seeing that and seeing what Penn State's been able to do with receivers pretty much since Jahan Dotson left, there's not too much convincing. If I'd rather go to a place like Oklahoma, that's pumped out some really good receivers over the past couple of years, or another school. There are a lot of options out there, but Penn State struggled to bring them in last offseason, and those that they did bring in struggled to live up to the hype. And I think that says something. If you're a defensive end, you see Chop Robinson, you see Arnold Ebiketie, and you say, oh, I might transfer to Penn State because it seems to work. But if you're a transfer wide receiver, you look at Dante Cephas and you say, I'm not too sure about that. It's still early. Not getting too worried yet, but we're starting to see some guys get off the board here.
I believe there's been some smoke about Julian Fleming and Nebraska. I think it's one thing to lose a receiver to Oklahoma for the reasons you specified, but if Kyle McCord and Julian Fleming go to Nebraska, and that's it's going to make a lot of people mad because that's Matt Rule. That's a guy a lot of people listening to this podcast. Sometimes it chaps me a little bit when we have to talk about everyone has to have a tie to Penn State to be considered for a job. But listen, there's a large contingent of people out there who want Matt Rule to be Penn State's head coach today, despite all the success that James Franklin has had. Do you think that is, if he ends up landing Julian Fleming, a guy Penn State had a relationship with before he committed to and went to Ohio State, that you'd look at that and say, dang, like that's a little bit scary for Penn State?
Yeah, that'd be pretty ironic if Fleming, ditches Penn State again and then goes to the guy who fans have called for years. Nebraska's on to something. I think, they're also leaning heavily toward, number one quarterback recruit in the country right now, Dylan Raiola. So it's kind of interesting to see, how all these fans kind of spoke so highly of Rule, and now we're starting to see him put together some of the pieces with the Cornhuskers. I don't know if Fleming and McCord are going to end up in Nebraska, but I think that would be interesting. I think Fleming's still a guy that Penn State should be highly considering. I think a lot of the reason why maybe his stats, took a bit of a plummel over the past couple of years is just because he was behind, some of the top college receivers over his career. So that's kind of been the case. And I'm interested to see what he's able to do as a number one or even a number two guy in a rotation.
Yeah, that'll be something I'm looking for, watching closely in the next couple of weeks before the portal closes, before the window after the new year. Seth, I'll get you out of here on this. What did you think of Penn State upsetting Ohio State? I guess it wasn't technically like a ranked upset because they weren't ranked in the Associated Press poll, but they were like, I think the second team receiving votes. They were 8-1. Penn State takes them down. Big win for Mike Rhoades after some big losses.
Yeah, it was an upset. It was an 8-1 team, and Penn State was coming off 5 straight losses. Really just needed a boost of momentum, a little confidence push, and I think that did it. They're lacking size right now. They're lacking interior defense. That's no question, and it hurt with Demetrius Lilly out. So you only had Wahab running the paint, who's struggled more or less defensively this whole year. But turned it up, in the second half, ended up out-rebounding Ohio State and hit some big shots. Leo Boyle came to life, Clary, and then finally Ace Baldwin Jr. hitting that dagger from downtown to, initially take the lead, which eventually, led to the victory. It was fun, it was cool, but I think after you lose 5 games, I think that builds a little bit of a chip on your shoulder. Where, even with a big win, this isn't everything. And we got to keep, going back to practice and fighting to make sure that skid doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I think the return to March Madness, that path is going to be pretty difficult for Penn State with 5 losses already, one of them being to Bucknell. That's a pretty bad loss, to carry on the resume. But, I could kind of maybe look at this as like a 2-year project, kind of like, Micah Shrewsbury, where you kind of laid the foundation in that first year. You did some good things enough to get people excited. And then maybe you go out and you make the NCAA tournament next year. I don't think it's unreasonable for Mike Rhoades to be on that program, get some guys here he's confident in, and then surround him with another class. So I don't think expectations should be too high. Granted, it's hard when you're coming off what Penn State did last season to kind of come down from that high and say, you're probably going to have to build back from that a little bit. But I think, a win like this is a sign that maybe you're closer to, where you were in that first year under Shrewsbury than you are to total oblivion.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that having a recruiting class helps, which they do have next year. They were only able to bring in 1 freshman this year who was Icelandic and not ranked. So I think, the year is only beginning. There are 10 new players, most of whom have never played together. So I think these kind of ups and downs are natural, and we'll start to see, them kind of mesh together more as the season goes along.
All right, Seth, that was a great conversation about this Penn State DC. If there's news in the next week, you might see Seth and I come back and do an emergency podcast like we did for the OC hire. If not, we will talk to you again next Wednesday. In the meantime, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Plenty of Steelers talk to come this week. Still the fallout from the loss to the Patriots, building toward the game on Saturday when they face the Colts. Christopher Carter on the North Shore Drive is going to be back a couple more times this week. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Make sure you like this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm, and we will talk to you again soon.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.